Right. I was just cued by one of my tech folks that we are live. Is that right, Caitlin? Thanks for letting us know. We were just sharing some gratitude to one another as you're coming in and joining us in the waiting room or from the waiting room. Hello and welcome.
Well, welcome back to the closing plenary of Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity. We have been so graced by your presence. Thank you. In the chat, please let us know where you're coming from right now. Enter the room. And remember that if you have tech questions, please go ahead and you can directly message the tech staff we have to help you. And also in honoring the community, we ask that you do not share the link for this Zoom. If you've joined us for the circle today preceding the final plenary, I hope it was enriching and grounding for you. Circles are a time of integration and affirmation. They remind us how we are connected to one another in both our uniqueness and in our shared experiences. They so beautifully remind us of the precious gift of listening and being heard. Hopefully you have had a few minutes to stretch and maybe get a snack and attend to the needs of your body as we enter the final stretch of this conference. In a fun fact kind of way, I wanted to share that we have had participants from 4 countries, the US, Canada, Britain, and Australia joining us, and then also individuals from 42 different states, including DC, for the conference. God is good, and we are grateful to the Holy Spirit's guiding and leading throughout these days. In terms of housekeeping, finally getting to the slide that you see, just a few reminders are on the screen. Let us create an environment of technological grace and care. As always, if you have any technical questions, please do go ahead and send those along to the tech in the chat. I invite you to take a moment sometime today, or perhaps in the next few days when you log back into the conference site, which you are able to do, to rewatch or maybe catch a workshop or a plenary that you weren't able to attend. I invite you to scroll once through the schedule and take special note of each presenter or speaker's name. Just take a moment to hold them in prayer for the wisdom they shared, for what they called forth in us, for the ways our speakers may have planted a seed or nourished a thought or a budding idea. I know for me, so many stories over these past 3 days shed light on a path forward, pointed me toward a next step of courage or a new area of imagination. I'd like to invite us to also recall the guiding questions that we offered at the beginning of this conference. How can restorative justice invite us to embrace healing approaches to harm and injustice? What are the unique gifts that the Catholic tradition and ministry lend to RJ practices in the US? We'll be asking you for your quick reaction to these questions in the evaluation. So you don't have to give us your final thought on it, but just what has been on your mind, what has been stirring. If you would like to share, we would like to hear. I would like to also offer a very special thank you to CMN staff and our board of directors, many of whom you have seen or heard throughout the conference, serving in presenting, circle keeping, praying, interviewing, moderating, and working with logistical details. We are ever grateful for your passion and commitment to this work. And a shout out to our wonderful conference sponsors who have gone above and beyond to make this virtual conference possible. I want to share my deep gratitude for our extraordinary conference planning committee. They took on this enormous endeavor, pivoting from an in-person conference in San Diego to an all virtual experience in just a matter of a few months. Many of these talented individuals you have seen with the RJ Catholic Conference, like the one that's behind me, their screen backgrounds. They are the mystery team. And Caitlin Morneau has masterfully led this dedicated group of leaders from CMN and from our co-hosting entities, the Diocese of San Diego and the University of San Diego's Center for Restorative Justice, making these 3 days a powerful reality. Two of our next speakers, Sean Horgan and David Karp, represent the University of San Diego and its dynamic restorative justice programming. The university is our closing plenary's sponsor. Take a look at this short video describing the work of the Restorative Justice Network of Catholic campuses.
The Restorative Justice Network of Catholic Campuses is a network that's hosted by the Center for Restorative Justice and is organized because we've discovered Catholic campuses have a particular interest in restorative justice because of its natural alignment with the Catholic social tradition.
Restorative justice is an alternative approach to resolving harm and conflict, one that focuses on relationships and bringing people back into community.
Making people think about harm in terms of people, right? Reminding people that we're human and that we deserve, feelings of safety and comfort in our different spaces. And so these tools give us avenues to be able to remind people of the humanness of who we all are.
Our network is made up of people on different Catholic campuses who are interested in restorative justice. We provide trainings for people to develop restorative programs on their campuses. We share syllabi for faculty who are teaching restorative justice, opportunities for people doing scholarship on restorative justice. And we're also interested in ways in which there can be partnerships between campuses and communities.
We really can see that these Catholic colleges as being the model for other institutions going forward. And I think that the network is really going to be the tool to really make that happen.
To sit in a circle, to listen, to contribute, and to seek solutions together, to me, that is what being persons for and with others is all about.
Having been here, I'm now recognizing that there is utility not just in the classroom, but also in relationship to people who are in student affairs at the university.
This is time well spent, not only in learning about restorative justice, the practices, the skill building, but also in connecting with other colleagues who are working toward very similar missions, who are seeking to really exemplify the best of Catholic higher education.
I love seeing eyes open and minds getting blown that there is another way of approaching harm and conflict in our community, and that particular way is more consistent with our mission and our identity as Catholic institutions. Good day, everyone, and welcome to our closing plenary. I have the pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, David Karp. David is a professor and director of the Center for Restorative Justice in the School of Leadership and Education Sciences at the University of San Diego. His current scholarship focuses on restorative justice in community and educational settings. For his work on campus restorative justice, he was the recipient of the 2019 Leadership and Innovation Award from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, as well as the 2011 Donald D. Gehring Award from the Association for Student Conduct Administration. David has published more than 100 academic papers and 6 books, including The Little Book on Restorative Justice for Colleges and Universities, Wounds That Do Not Bind, Victim-Based Perspectives on the Death Penalty, and The Community Justice Ideal. David serves on the board of directors for the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. He is also a member of the planning team for the Restorative Justice Network of Catholic Campuses. He has previously served as the Associate Dean of Students and Professor of Sociology at Skidmore College. He received his Bachelor's of Arts in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of California at Berkeley and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Washington. Please join me in helping to welcome to our closing plenary, Dr. David Karp.
Thank you, Sean. It's really nice to have friends introduce each other, and I'm going to be talking about you in a little bit, so I'll be right back at you. So I want to talk about what does it mean for a campus to become a restorative university, and talk about the work at the University of San Diego as an example of that. And I know many people that are clicked into this Zoom call are not attached to a campus, and so maybe wondering why would this be relevant to me? And I think by way of closing the conference, it's important for us to think about the next stage in the restorative justice journey, which is really about institutionalization. How do we embed these ideas more fully into organizations like universities or K-12 schools or the criminal justice system, wherever it may be? So maybe there'll be some thoughts about that. We can go to the next slide. I wanted to mention the RJ Network of Catholic Campuses. I built this slide before I realized we would share that video, but I wanted to say that currently 77 of the 247 Catholic campuses in this country are represented in our network. So that's exciting for us that we have people who are getting a steady feed of restorative ideas that they can bring to their campuses. And who knows, maybe at the end of this conference, we'll have more represented. And part of the work, I think, that has strengthened this network is Susan Sharp's paper. I saw her name being admitted into this Zoom call. And of course, there was an earlier workshop at this conference about the close alignment of restorative justice ideas and Catholic social teaching. We can go to the next slide. So when I think about what does it mean for a campus to be a restorative university, first and foremost, what I'm thinking about is that it's a place for exploration. That is, of course, what campuses are all about, for students to explore new ideas, for faculty to explore new ideas. And so campuses become guideposts, not the only, but guideposts for the larger society, places of experimentation and new ideas. And there are three areas for this in terms of restorative justice. One is the campus itself behaving like a restorative community, meaning how we treat each other, the research that's done on campuses, and the courses that get taught. And we can go to the next slide. So the building blocks here that I want to talk about are institutional mission, academic affairs, which is the part of the university that has everything to do with faculty and classes and what gets taught, and student affairs, which has everything to do on campus with the life of students outside the classroom, where they sleep, what they eat, the programs and organizations and clubs and teams that they belong to. So there's a lot of restorative work to be done on all of these fronts, and we can go to the next slide. Which we'll begin with focusing on institutional mission, and we can go to the next slide. Mission, every campus has their own mission statement, of course, but as proud as USD might be of its own mission statement, it's really not all that different from other campuses. So just thinking about USD's mission, the question is, how much does RJ align with USD's mission and vision? So USD is a Roman Catholic institution committed to advancing academic excellence, expanding liberal and professional knowledge, creating a diverse and inclusive community, preparing leaders dedicated to ethical conduct and compassionate service. And it sets the standard for an engaged contemporary Catholic university where innovative change makers confront humanity's urgent challenges. So nowhere in that statement is we're getting ahead of ourselves, Emma, that's okay. Nowhere in the statement is the phrase restorative justice, but I think you can see a lot of potential connections. So I could make the case, but yes, let's go to the next slide. And instead of relying on me, I asked in a survey a couple of years ago, administrators on Catholic campuses, so we had 104 respond, representing 69 different Catholic campuses. Straight up, I asked them, how much did they think RJ aligns with their school's mission? And there were three options. There was not aligned, and as you can see here, nobody said that it was not aligned. So that's good. And then some 20-odd% said they believed that their missions were somewhat aligned with RJ, and happily 70-some-odd% said that they thought their missions were very aligned. So that's cool. That's an important starting place, that there isn't philosophical opposition. But if we go to the next slide, I think this is a good example of what it means in practice when you have mission alignment. Sean Horrigan was the director of the Office of the Assistant Dean of Students, which is a rather bland name in this case for the Office of Student Conduct. So when students got in trouble, this was the office that would adjudicate those cases. And so he was able to persuade the university to change the office's name in 2012 to the Office of Ethical Standards and Restorative Practices, which is a fantastic move and no easy feat. And even though Sean has moved on from that office to a different part of the university, his work lives on. And you can imagine, even just subliminally, how important it is to have this name change, that someone working or directing this office in its previous title would not feel any obligation to know anything about restorative justice. They just needed to know about the wishes and aspirations of the Assistant Dean of Students, or the VP of students, or whomever their boss might be. But now, it would be hard to direct this office or work for this office and not need to know something about restorative practices. So that's kind of mission alignment in practice. And we can go to the next slide. I want to turn our attention to student affairs, so the lives of students, and we can go right to the next slide, and think about some ways that restorative justice is manifested in the life of students. So we like to think of USD as a laboratory for piloting RJ initiatives, and these can be piloted in these two major arenas: community building and responding to harm. So there's ongoing community building on a college campus, because a quarter of the campus turns over every year. And so we're orienting a new group all of the time, building communities, whether it's on a floor or on a team or in a club. And then, of course, there's harm that is done. Either it's a result of the general campus climate or particular incidents of misconduct. And then, of course, people come back if they have been suspended, for example, and how do we receive them restoratively? So we can go to the next slide. I want to give a couple of examples. So last year, we piloted what we called alcohol harm impact circles. So these were for students who had first-time alcohol violations. Of course, the drinking age is 21 and students arrive at USD at age 18. So it's almost inevitable that maybe even by the second night on campus, they might have gotten themselves in trouble on this front. Rather than take a punitive approach, we used restorative circles to engage the students in a community building effort to help them think about what is USD all about, where is their place in the community, how could they be meaningful, positive contributing members to the community. So rather than focus on, in this case, what they're doing wrong, we were really inviting them to think about what they could do right. So this was no small effort. 75 students participated in 20 circles, which meant training lots of facilitators for this. And if we go to the next slide, we were faced this summer with trying to orient 1,600 new students for the fall semester. And we had to orient them online and create a sense of community, even if they were not coming to campus and living their college life online. Each of those students were invited to participate in a series of circles. So they got to know their group of students pretty well over these 3 circle times. With this many students, we had to train a lot of facilitators, 80 of them. So this is no small undertaking when you think about really using restorative practice for an entire community. And then we can go to the next slide. And then just in the last week and next week, we are offering a series of election-focused circles. So inviting students to share their experience in coping with participating in the political process, particularly knowing how painful it's been around race issues. So these are the kinds of ongoing circles. This is a climate-related circle, a campus climate-related circle. That's another new endeavor or new initiative for us. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so enough about students. I want to think about faculty for a moment, and we can go to the next slide. Oh, that's interesting. That's not my next slide. There we go. That's better. One thing I want to share is that when I got started researching restorative justice in the 1990s, I was a very happy camper as an academic because academics like to be experts, and I could read everything there was to be read about restorative justice and feel proud of that. As you can see, I conducted a study to see how many research studies are published every year on restorative justice, beginning in the early 1990s. And as you can see, beginning in the early 2000s, we're hovering around 200 or so journal articles published every year. So it's astonishing how much research is being conducted on restorative justice. And besides the fact that it generates a lot of stress and anxiety for me because I can't keep up, it's a very exciting time, and the faculty at universities are playing an incredibly important role in understanding the various components of this large movement. And we can go to the next slide. Not only are faculty doing research, but they're teaching. And so when we think about teaching, there are a couple of important arenas to consider. First is pedagogy. So not what they're teaching, but how they're teaching and how they might be building a restorative classroom. We are really innovating in terms of using restorative practices in the classroom to engage students in meaningful dialogues about whatever topics they may be studying. Then, of course, there are courses taught about restorative justice. I keep seeing more and more variation. For example, I just saw an announcement from about an anthropology course on the archaeology of RJ. Interesting. I've seen courses on in architecture schools on building restorative spaces. So there's proliferation in the kinds of courses that are being taught. We offer a certificate in restorative justice. There are a few other campuses that are also doing that. You might be interested in exploring it. So what does it mean to not just take a class, but to concentrate a set of courses for professional development in restorative justice? There are a few schools that are offering master's degrees in restorative justice. We have that aspiration, we'll get there. It's a big task to create a new master's degree, but I think that's where the field is headed. And finally, I want just to note how important this last bullet is, integrating restorative justice into key disciplines. So we think about how widespread restorative justice has become in K through 12 schools, but rarely do we ask what new teachers are taught in colleges of education. Right now, I have colleagues that are very enthusiastic about restorative justice down the hall in our College of Education here at USD, but they tell me there is no room in the students' curriculum for restorative justice courses or for their students to take our certificate. This is tragic and needs to change, because philosophically, they're not opposed, they are enthusiastic, but integrating or changing or altering curriculum is a huge undertaking. Talia Gonzalez, a leading expert on legislation nationally on restorative justice, says we have to stop thinking about restorative justice as new. It's embedded in statutes in every state, yet it is not taught in law schools. That's a problem. It needs to change. So some key disciplines we need to think about in order to truly build a restorative university. So I have one more slide to go to, and I just wanted to close on this note. I borrowed a quote from our colleague Lindsay Pointer, who has also done work to build a restorative university. She was part of the team at Victoria University in New Zealand. And she says, a restorative university intentionally fosters positive relationships between community members founded on respect, equality, and open communication. This includes implementing both reactive measures, including restorative justice as a response to conflicts and rule violations, and proactive measures, including a circle process as a way to build a positive culture rooted in restorative principles. I think that's a great way to close, and to acknowledge that in many ways, the good work and hard work is ahead, not just coming up with new ideas, but figuring out how to make them last. And I will end it there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. Let's give David a virtual round of applause. Thank him for his time and sharing his work, his research, and some thoughts around how higher education, and particularly Catholic higher education, is supporting the movement of restorative justice. We want to take a moment before our next speaker to just reflect for a moment. If you have some scratch paper and a pencil, something to write with, or else just sort of reflect in your own head on a few different prompts. Because we want you thinking about, as you leave this conference experience, what your next steps might be. So we invite you to just think for a few moments about what your next step might be if you were coming from this place. What would your next step be if you were coming from the place of being courageous, decisive, action-oriented, and willing to take a risk? Just reflect for a moment. What would that look like? What would your next step look like, or what would your next step be if you were coming from the place of being caring, compassionate, and attentive to the needs of others? What would that look like? What would your next step be if you were coming from the place of being visionary, creative, imaginative, surprising, humorous, and eccentric? What would the next step look like? And finally, what would your next step look like if you were coming from a place of being wise, thoughtful, reasoned, mindful of institutional complexity, and attentive to institutional goals? Thank you. And that's my way of ending. Somehow I knew that would happen. Thank you. Please take some time to journal and reflect about your time here and what steps you'll take, because the collective steps of this entire group of people can certainly add to the movement of restorative justice. Our next speaker, I'm really proud to introduce, is Father David Kelly. Father David is the founder and executive director of Precious Blood Ministry and Reconciliation in Chicago, Illinois. In 2020, he, along with other members of his religious congregation, began PBMR to create a place for those who have been impacted by violence and conflict. PBMR reaches out to the one who has been harmed, to the one who has done harm, and to the community. They also strive to be a resource to other groups and communities who seek reconciliation. Father David has worked for the Colby House at Assumption, a parish-based jail ministry of the Archdiocese of Chicago, since 1985. For more than 30 years, he has worked as a chaplain in Cook County Jail and Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. He has experience working for jails and prisons in Ohio and Florida. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry from St. Joseph's College, a Master's of Divinity, Master's of Arts in Cross-Cultural Studies, and a doctorate in ministry from Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. His doctoral thesis is entitled Responding to Violence Among Urban Youth, a Restorative Approach. He has been trained and certified as a mediator from DePaul University, as well as in the restorative practice of peacemaking circles. He has published articles and spoken on reconciliation, restorative justice, and jail and detention ministry. Please help me in welcoming Father David Kelly.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. I will gladly offer some of my time to your son if he has. Seems like that's the best part of this. So I always like it when, as much as we might plan, things go a little bit awry in these kinds of Zoom kind of conferences. So it's good to be here. So I am on the south side of Chicago. Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation in reality was founded in 2002, not 2020. So we are a restorative justice organization on the south side of Chicago, working with young people and families who have been impacted by violence and incarceration. So what we strive to do is, within a community that knows very well violence, and where a large percentage of our young men and women, growingly, are subject to incarceration, we strive to create a space in this environment where healing is possible and reconciliation is a goal. Precious Blood has 5 pillars. Radical hospitality, because so many of our young people who come here might not come here ready to be received very well. So they might have an attitude, a chip on their shoulder because of all the trauma in their own lives. And so we have to be really skilled in trying to create an environment where they feel like they're a part of Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, or PBMR. We're also accompaniment. So most of our staff are young men and women who are closer to the issues. So many of our staff have spent time in prison. Others have grown up in this neighborhood. And they are the ones who are on the front lines, really working with young people and families who have been impacted by this, by so much trauma, because they know it themselves. And so they accompany young people and families through this process of trying to reach some sort of stability in their own lives. The third is we are relentless in our work. So a relentless engagement of young people and families, trying to create a space where young people who otherwise don't find themselves in schools or community groups or even churches don't feel welcome, where they are here and they may say to me, Kelly, thanks, but no thanks, but we're still in relationship with them. And equally, we strive to be in relationship with systems and stakeholders. I oftentimes say I have a ton of patience for a 14-year-old who acts like a 14-year-old, but a system that acts like a 14-year-old is much more difficult for me. And so I strive, though, because I am restorative, to be in relationship with them as well. So that means being in relationship with the courts, being in relationship with the police, without giving up our values and who we are as an organization, but yet not going to battle with them. And then the last pillar is collaboration, really working with other organizations as well. We started in 2002. We did a lot of work with the courts in victim offender circles. And what we found in those kinds of instances were people were being referred to us either by the state's attorney or by community groups from outside of our community. And while we could do the circle and we could really reach a consensus about repairing harm and what the accountability factor was, oftentimes the ongoing relationship was difficult. And so we reached out to other organizations to see if they would join us in this effort of creating these community-led spaces where people could come and the community themselves could begin to seek to repair the harm and hold one another accountable to build that kind of community cohesion. And so now we have 7 organizations, 7 restorative justice hubs scattered throughout the city. We share a common database. We have a training academy. And what it allows us to do is communities now have a place at the table, whereas so often communities are told what they ought to do and perhaps given a little funding to do it. In this situation, we have really taken the lead in some of these issues, violence prevention, creating a safer community. And because there are 7 organizations and 7 communities, that our place at the table is that much more strong. And we have some universities, Adler University in particular, helping us with some evaluations and really kind of tracking what are the outcomes in the work that we're trying to do. So we're on the south side of Chicago, and restorative justice really allows us to live out our mission of reconciliation. So I've been in jails and detention center work all my adult life. I've also worked on the south side of Chicago as a parish priest. And I've been in courtrooms too many times. And oftentimes when I go in those courtrooms, that the focus is on punishment. The focus is on what are we going to do with the person who did the harm. And absolutely no effort, no resources are given to someone who has been harmed. There's no accompaniment for that person. They might be kept aware of what's going on in court. They might even be called to testify, but out of that, there's nothing else that really they're offered. And so when some of those became very personal, where I knew both the one who was harmed and the one who did the harm, we thought that we could do better than that. And so in 2002, we had the opportunity to start Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation here on the South Side. And what really led us to restorative justice, because we sought a way to really bring people together for healing and reconciliation. And I picked up a book by Kay Pranis, From Crime to Community. And in that book, as I began to read that book, I said, this is so incredibly Catholic, because a peacemaking circle, which is a practice of restorative justice, uses symbols and signs and stories to create a safe enough space where people really could speak their truth and hear the truth of others. And when you focus on relationship and focus on safety, then what happens is whatever the issue that might have brought you there is so much more easily dealt with, because you're not talking about some other, but you're now talking with someone who you have a relationship with. And so we quickly, to do this work of reconciliation, embraced a restorative justice philosophy. And as we know, restorative justice is all about relationships. There's 3 things I hope that I can kind of share across during this little bit of time I have. One is that much of what I speak about and what we encounter is the impact of trauma and harm. That while an incident may be fleeting, someone getting hurt, the inequities that are part of these communities, racism, the lasting trauma is really what's impactful. And so we really tend to the lasting trauma that is a part of people's lives. The other thing is that we can't punish our way out of this. This is not a criminal justice issue. This is many times a public health issue. And so really that's where restorative justice comes in, to really seek to repair harm rather than just punish the person that's done the harm. And then thirdly, what I hope we walk away with is this is about the church and community and society. We can't just sit on the sidelines. We can't just be spectators. This is a work that we need to be about. And as we entered into those muddled messes, our vocation, our call is to give witness to the possibilities, give witness to hope, give witness to life, even in the midst of so much trauma and pain. Oftentimes when I give a talk, I take a young person with me to kind of really speak to the community and the young person's kind of experience of community. I have 40 years of stories, but they're all stories. And so oftentimes it's more impactful to have someone who's actually lived in the community and has been impacted by some of the things within our community to allow them to speak. And I went to Dominican University and I took Joe along with me. Joe's a young man that's very able to share who he is, and he's very authentic and really speaks from his heart. And so as we spoke that night, Joe was doing what Joe did. He really talked about some of the things going on in his life, some of the trauma in his own life. He's been locked up a number of times. He has family members who are incarcerated. His has been a tough life. And he shared that with this group of students. And as always, the students were captivated. On the way home, I noticed Joe was very quiet. Now, normally that means that somebody's on their social media, they're on Facebook or some social media app. But I noticed that the phone was in his lap and he was just looking out the window. And I asked Joe, I said, Joe, what's up? What's anything the matter? And he just shook his head, no, nothing. But he was still staring out the window. And then I asked Joe, I said, Joe, just look at me for a minute. And when he turned toward me, he had tears in his eyes. I said, Joe, what's up? What happened? What's hurting you? And through the tears, he spoke about how he just felt that people had really left him. What had happened was that as he spoke his story, as he told his story, some of those trauma events, some of what he carried came forth, and he carried that with him. And because we were on our way back from Dominican University, and it was Chicago kind of traffic, stop and go, Joe and I spent the next hour or an hour and a half just talking about some of the issues that were going on in his life, the things that were bothering him. It became really a sacred moment in which Joe and I could connect on a level that allowed him to express what he was going through and what was happening in his life. Traumatic events undermine everything that gives us meaning. It really sets us up on end. It causes fragmentation in our own lives. Things that used to make sense no longer make sense. We oftentimes hear families who have lost a child to homicide talk about those weeks and months even after as a complete blur, that they don't even know really what happened as they went through the motions of the funeral and preparing for the funeral. Because trauma, those events in our lives cause that kind of fragmentation and hurt. But one of the greatest protective factors in all that is a sense of relationship, a sense of community. David Brooks, who is a New York Times columnist and an author, speaks about community as community being steeped in relationship as a thick community, that neighbors know one another and they care for one another. And that's so critical in this kind of work, that in the work that we do is to really strive to create relationships that help a person like Joe get through some of those difficulties. In 1995 here in Chicago, we had a horrific heat wave, and there were a lot of people who lost their lives. But there was a study about two communities, and they were adjacent communities. They had similar demographics. One community suffered 6 times more deaths than the other community. And in the study, one of the things they said was, there was one neighborhood, the one neighborhood that suffered less deaths, had places where people could establish relationships with one another. They could come together and build relationships with one another. And so they checked on one another during the heat wave. And as they checked on one another, they tended to one another's needs. You wouldn't think that a library or a community center would have that great of an impact on a heat wave, and yet it does. So building relationships gives us resilience. It allows us to get through some difficult times. I may not be able to really change what young people go through. I may not be able to stop some of the violence within our community, but I can create a community of care, a community of hope. I can create a space and a place where people feel welcome, where they don't feel like we're just tolerating you. And in that kind of space, we can tend to the healing and the resilience of young people. Work with a lot of mothers who have lost children to homicide. Sister Donna, who's on staff here, works with them as well. And some of those mothers, I had a group of Spanish-speaking mothers, and they knew I went into the jail, juvenile detention center, and they asked me about that. Now, these are all mothers who've lost a child to homicide, so you can imagine that kind of trauma and that kind of pain. And as they asked me questions about the young people, in particular about juvenile detention center, I invited them to come in, and they quickly said no. But one of the things I invited them to was the mass. I do a mass there on Saturdays, or did before COVID. And that they knew, that was safe. And so they came in and attended mass with the young people. And then after mass, we did a circle. And I had invited some young people who could speak Spanish from their heart, who could really talk about some of their feelings in Spanish. And we created a space where mothers and these young people, many of whom were being tried as adults, sat together. And as you know, this as the beginning of a circle is always a check-in and an introduction. And so as you use that talking piece to go around, we began to introduce ourselves. And the mothers, when the talking piece came to them, just wept. Their identity was of losing a child to homicide. And the young people, of course, their eyes were wide open. And then as the talking piece went around to the young persons, they began to speak. And they spoke about one not knowing his mother, another a mother in prison, yet another a mother in drugs. And they started to tell about their stories and who they were beyond just being incarcerated and being labeled a delinquent. And what you found in that space was the mothers who came in pretty tentative, pretty guarded, pretty, I would even say, suspicious. As the young people began to tell their stories, they began to lean in, and they saw these young people so differently. They recognized that they were not just delinquents, but rather they were young people that carried their own trauma, their own pain. They too were victims. And so there was a bond that formed in this unlikely group of folks who all experience trauma, different kinds of trauma, but yet alone were able to connect on a more real and relational way. And as we left the space, the young people were ushered back up to their cells. The mothers, as mothers do, said, well, what now? What are we gonna do? And I said, I don't know. And they said, you can't just leave them. And I said, well, we can't stay either. And these mothers then went on to insist that they come back and they bring food for these young people. And so what happened in that space was a new relationship was forged, and mothers kept checking in on them. A community, albeit different, was formed, and the well-being of those young people were foremost in that community. This work, restorative justice, and in particular the peacemaking circle, is really what we as Catholic organizations, Catholic parishes, Catholic institutions all ought to be about. It's the gospel message of reconciliation, bringing us to go to those places and spaces that maybe are uncomfortable to us, and yet witnessing to the power of God to transform us and others into a new entity, into new relationships. If you think about some of the gospel stories, the gospel story of Emmaus, and how when Jesus was crucified, the two apostles were leaving Jerusalem to Emmaus, going to Emmaus, not so much where they were going, but what they're getting away from, the trauma, the pain, the hurt of their own lives. And we hear the story of how the stranger begins to accompany them and walk alongside them. And the stranger, we know as Jesus, asks them, so what are you talking about? And they said, of course, don't you know what happened in Jerusalem, and began to tell their story. Jesus says, no, tell me about it. Tell me what your pain is. Tell me what your hurt is. And they told their story. And only after they finished their story did Jesus then place that story into the context of the larger story of our Christian story, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This work is about creating a space where people can be heard, where their stories can be valued, where we can actually tend to one another's needs and not just judge someone that impedes our understanding of one another. So I know we're running short on time. I'm going to kind of wrap it up there and let Caitlin and Christiane take over from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. You have enlivened us to think in new and creative ways about questions that are core to who we are and what we have been journeying with throughout the course of this conference. I can think of no better way for us to close. So thank you. And I wonder, our folks in the participant room, we can again offer a gesture of thanks. If you feel so moved, maybe add an affirmation or note of gratitude in the chat for Father David and Dr. David Karp. Thank you so, so much. Wonderful. Well, before we have a beautiful prayer to close us out this afternoon, and before we move into that, while we have you and have your attention, we really genuinely wish to hear from you about how your experience has been. There's been a lot that we've been able to take in from one another and sense, but we really want to know how this experience has been. So I know our chat master, Sister Laria, is going to drop into the chat a link, and she may need, I know we're also offering lots of gratitude. Keep that coming. We can drop it multiple times. There is a link to an evaluation form that I'd like us to just each take a few minutes to open up and enter some thoughts as a way for us to share while things are fresh, while we are energized, how we've experienced this time, this event, this conference. So thank you so much, Laura. There is the link. Go ahead and open that. We'll take just a moment. Begin filling out your responses. If you prefer to come back to it later today, but you did do that, but hopefully it won't feel too cumbersome to just enter some feedback for us about how we can, what's been positive for you, what can be improved. Thank you for your intentionality in sharing with us. And maybe if you have gotten through the evaluation, want to share anything in the chat. At the end of Father David's talk, the question that came to me was, what is God making new in you at this time? So please do add your thoughts into that evaluation form. And if you'd like to share any reflection in the chat about what God is making new in you, you're invited to do so as well. So I encourage you, if you haven't finished yet, I encourage you to continue entering your responses. But I too just wanted to offer a few notes of gratitude in addition to echoing all of those people who Chris Ann acknowledged at the start of this session. I have to also give a big word of thanks to Chris Ann herself and your visionary leadership as Executive Director at Catholic Mobilizing Network. Thank you so much. Also give a huge shout out to our tech and chat masters who are really too many to be named in this moment, but how you have just expertly helped let logistics run smoothly so that we can fully enter into this experience together has been tremendous. And we are all so grateful to each of you. I want to thank those who served as circle keepers earlier this afternoon for all of your preparation and holding space together. I want to once again thank the amazing Lily Alvarez, who has been our Spanish language interpreter throughout this conference. You have just been incredible, and we are so grateful to you. And finally, I want to thank Drew Dernovich, our graphic scriber, who we can see his artwork now, hopefully large. I can on my screen. And it is also posted to the conference website so that we have been able to not only visually process what we're taking in and hearing, but also be able to remember it together. If we so choose to go back to these images later, we invite you to do that. So the last couple of things I wanted to mention were just about the gifts and treasures that you have all offered this conference along the way. There has been so much energy around sharing resources and opportunities, and we see and hear you. What we plan to do after this conference is to go back through each of the recordings and each of the chats, and where there are resources being shared, culling those together, gathering them and sharing them back out in ways that we can reference back, can plug in and keep engaging in new ways. And in addition, it was really our hope to be intentional about creating virtual community together. And I know I have felt that. I hope and pray that you have too. And we hope and pray that that can continue beyond this conference time closing. And so please just be on the lookout and on the watch for emails from Catholic Mobilizing Network about ways to stay connected with one another, ways to engage with the resources being shared, and support and encourage one another in this ministry and in this call to restorative justice. And so to close us out in prayer, you can think of no one better than our CMN's Board of Directors Chair, Ralph McLeod. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good evening, everyone. To begin our closing prayer, I want to be very personal and quote a bit of scripture, that being, I thank God for you. So I want to thank God publicly and certainly with each one of you for the heads, the hearts, and the hands that came together to put such a wonderfully appropriate conference together, given the timing where we find ourselves so desperately need. So thank you. While there's been so many thank you so far, there's been nowhere near enough in terms of how the gratitude that I'm personally feeling this afternoon. So I'd like to invite us to the present, not the stresses and the tensions that may accompany the next few days, not the anxiety of rushing to make sure that we're logged on time, or the suffering with Zoom fatigue, but right now, right to the present, because of the past and in fidelity to the future, we stand in a very sacred space, not past of yesterday, not the tomorrow of the future, but in the majestic moment of right now. We've been formed by the past few days and spirit fired for the future. So I'd invite us to pray. A prayer that was penned by Sister Addie Walker, school sister of Notre Dame, down in, I believe she's in San Antonio now. You can find it on the Catholic Mobilizing Network's website. And if you would pray with me. And this is probably one of the rare times that you're going to hear you can either mute yourself or unmute yourself, however you feel comfortable, but you're welcome to do that. As we pray, good and gracious God, we gather once again this day to name you as our God, God of all the nations and peoples, God of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, the God of Jacob, of Leah and Rachel. We praise you and we bless you and we glorify you. You are God of life, of love, of hope, of healing, of justice and mercy and compassion. We ask that you bestow on us, O God, once again this day, a renewed commitment to stand with you and in life and love, hope and healing, justice and mercy and compassion. United in our love for all peoples and for our life, we stand committed to building a world based on your covenant of love and life. We come together committed to ridding the world of communities of violence in all of its forms and racism in all of the ways that it impacts and plagues our criminal legal systems. We pray too that you remain with us, keeping us faithful to the promise that we make this day to promote restorative justice in our time and in our land. We ask these things of you, O God, for you are God from whom every family takes its name. Amen, amen, and amen. God bless you and thank you for sharing your time with us.